Good. Well, it is so good to be here this evening, and with ISOC and also with the Cambridge Muslim College. I must say it's a great honour to be a trustee of that new institution, and I think to see institutional creativity in action, as I've watched the genesis of that new college, which is a wonderful initiative for Cambridge, it seems to me. And in particular, I think we should honour Tim Winter, who can't be here this evening, sadly. He had to take somebody else's place elsewhere. But his work, he's the dean of the college, and his work in over many years ensuring that it was founded in the right sort of way. It's an immense thing to found a new institution, and Tim has taken the lead in that and put a huge amount of work into it, and then to have such a wonderful principal as the first principal as Michael is really wonderful as well. And I must say I think the whole sort of ecology of Cambridge is enriched by having this new dimension, and may it last for hundreds of years. And as Michael said, I am the director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, and there's two events in the next week that I'd just like to say, are an aspect not as significant as the founding of the Cambridge Muslim College, but nevertheless we hope equally long-lasting. That on Wednesday of next week, the Omani Minister for Higher Education, she is coming to sign with our Vice-Chancellor here in Cambridge an endowment for the Sultan Qaboos Professorship in Abrahamic faiths and shared values, and the holder of which is going to be the academic director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme as well. So that's a permanent endowment which one can see going on, one trusts, also century after century. And the other, on the Thursday of next week, there is an event which I hope many of you will come to. There's a public lecture called Disagree, for God's Sake. It's on Jewish philosophy, truth and dialogue, and that is to celebrate a Jewish-Muslim joint endowment for a post in Jewish studies, which again is a wonderful thing to happen, that there should be Jewish money and Muslim money coming together into a post in Jewish studies. And we are really delighted about that. That's at 5 o'clock in our Faculty of Divinity next Thursday. And all of these things are not unrelated to my theme tonight, because the ways in which interfaith engagement has gone on in Cambridge, giving a sort of atmosphere in which these sort of things can happen, is, I think, rather important. And one of the major strands in that has been the joint reading of scriptures, and Principal Michael has been involved in that as well, and some of the rest of you I know here too, and I want to talk about that. But first of all, just by way of introduction, I published another book last week, actually, which is also relevant to this matter of how we engage with each other, and it's called The Future of Christian Theology. But it's one of 3 books to be published by Blackwell. The other two of which are The Future of Muslim Theology and The Future of Jewish Theology. And it seems to me it says something that there are those 3 books happening, and the 3 authors all know each other very well. In fact, one of the seminal moments in my own book on the future of Christian theology was in Abu Dhabi some time ago, when at a critical stage in the book's genesis, the other 2 authors, Arif Nayed, who's the director of Kalam Research and Media in Dubai, and Stephen Kepnes, who's a professor from Colgate University in the States, when they came together and did a radical critique of what I'd already written for my book and the outline of my book and so forth. And it was one of those great moments when you felt you really engaged in intensive conversation with the others. And it wasn't that they were telling me what to write or something, but that what they contributed in that critical and constructive conversation has fed into the way the book now is. And I think often that's the best way for interfaith engagement, where you do your own thing, but you really listen carefully as you can, and open yourself to the insights that come from elsewhere. And when it's all in the context of friendship, as that was, then it can be a really deeply helpful thing. Now, that book, in that book, and this was part of the discussion with Arif and Steve as well, what are the main things facing religious thought in the 21st century? That was one of the questions we were asking. And the three that I came up with over the last few years and through that conversation and so forth were, first of all, it was very significant having a conversation with Osama Hassan, a dear friend who has just been lecturing some of you in the Cambridge Muslim College beforehand and teaches a course there. One of them was about religion and the sciences. That's going to be a huge thing, it seems to me, this century. And the sort of questions that Osama teaches, those of you who are on that course, are just hugely important for the future. I remember a very interesting meeting at the John Templeton Foundation in Istanbul, when we were plunged into the middle of the sort of debate that's going on in Turkey at the moment, not least about Darwinianism and so forth in relation to Islam. But those debates are hugely important. The second thing was religion in the public sphere, that religion has clearly entered into the public sphere on a world stage, since the Iranian Revolution, Solidarity Revolution in Poland, all that's been on in South America, and since, that was in the 80s, those things, and then since, that religion has had a new presence in the public sphere, for bad as well as good reasons, as we know. But it's here to stay, it seems to me. It's perfectly clear that the 4 or 5 billion of the world's population who are directly involved in the world's religions aren't going to go away. Some of the fantasies of 20th century secularism seem to suggest that religion was dying out. It's quite clearly not. It's around. It goes through all sorts of transformations, and I think rightly goes through transformations. But that it is around and very much in the public sphere, and that is going to be, it seems to me, ethics, politics, all the areas to do with how religions are involved in the shaping of societies, that is going to be a huge issue in the 21st century as well. But the third one is the one that I want to concentrate now on, which is interfaith engagement. Unless the faiths learn how to engage with each other in good ways and to draw on their resources for peace and the flourishing not only of their own communities but of the wider world, then we're in for a very bad century indeed. And it's clear that there are many parts of the world where there are huge problems, crises, killings, dangers, and so forth. And therefore this, it seems to me, underlines the huge significance of interfaith engagement for our century. And what I want to talk about is just one practice in that. I'm not claiming at all that this is the only way to do it, but it is one way. It's a way that I have found very fruitful. It's the way that really has provided the DNA, if you like, of the Cambridge Interfaith programme here in Cambridge. And that is called, the label's been given to it, is Scriptural Reasoning, and it's Muslims, Christians, Jews getting together to study their scriptures, to have conversations in relationship to it, and seeing where that leads. And I want to reflect on why that makes sense and what happens when it is done. But first of all, let me say a little bit of autobiography in relation to interfaith engagement. I'm a Dubliner from Dublin, and I was part of a 3% minority in Dublin, a minority of Dublin Protestants. I'm a Dublin Anglican. It's a very rare breed. You don't might find all that many of them around. But that sense of being in a small minority, and you might say, well, they were all Christians, weren't they? In Ireland, when I was born, they were different religions, let me tell you. There was no doubt at all that there were huge differences. But when I was a teenager, the Second Vatican Council happened in the 1960s. And I remember the change, the transformation of an atmosphere where the whole ways in which Protestants and Catholics could view each other underwent a change during that time. It even affected me as a teenager in school. And it brought home to me how very important were religious developments on the international level as well as more locally, and how something like the Second Vatican Council could change the reality of life for a great many people. Now I leap forward to, what's my book stop? I leap forward to the time when interfaith engagement really became a reality for me, which was when I spent 15 years in the University of Birmingham. And I was also living in inner city Birmingham, and it was a very ethnically, religiously, racially mixed area. I had a house mosque on the corner of the road where I lived. And all sorts of things were going. Interfaith engagement was really coming alive in Birmingham at the time in a whole new way. And there was all sorts of academic things. I was involved in a Jewish Christian centre in Selly Oak Colleges, also in a Muslim Christian centre there, both of which are now subsumed into the University of Birmingham. There were all sorts of practical, collaborative things happening, and one of my colleagues was the philosopher John Hick, with whom I had 9 years while we were colleagues together. I had an ongoing argument, along with many other people as well, because I just did not go along with his approach to interfaith matters, but he was a very provocative dialogue partner. But in all that, I felt there was something missing, something seriously missing in it. And I'm able to articulate it now. I'm not sure I was then. You know how sometimes you don't realise what you're missing until you find it? Like falling in love. But that what was seen to be missing was that there was nowhere where people of different faiths were able to engage deeply with each other in a long-term way, in such a way that their faith was really involved. In other words, there were all sorts of very interesting interfaith encounters where you learn what you do and so forth. There was all sorts of study of the other religions as interesting phenomena, and that were all sorts of disciplines brought to bear on it academically and so forth. But that sort of engagement, where each could, in their integrity, as people within a particular tradition, really engage not just in a one-off way, but in a way that's continual, because we all know a religion is such a rich, complex thing. It's a long-term thing for all of those of us who are committed within it. And unless you can be involved in a similar sort of relationship long-term with other people, you're not going to really engage with them. And what I realised was that there was just lacking this ongoing conversation, collegiality, and even the possibility of friendship. And looking back afterwards, I realised I emerged from 15 years in Birmingham without any really close Muslim and Jewish friends, which has been exactly the opposite as regards what happened since then. So I will come to that. So what did happen? And what happened was that in the early 1990s, after I'd moved to Cambridge, I got involved on the fringe of a group at the American Academy of Religion. It was a group called Textual Reasoning. And basically they were a group of young Jewish text scholars, of Tanakh and Talmud, and philosophers, just modern academic philosophers, who had engaged with each other because the philosophers thought that the text scholars weren't modern enough, weren't engaged with contemporary issues, and the text scholars thought that the philosophers just weren't into their scriptures and commentaries on them, Talmud and so forth. And in other words, that they each felt that the other was lacking in some fundamental respect, but they recognized this and engaged with each other energetically and with terrific sense of humour, I must say as well, but also really seriously. When Jews argue, they argue. And it was no holds barred intellectual argument about things, but also bringing their whole traditions into it too, because they were from different types of Jewish tradition. But it was a quite extraordinary experience to be privileged to be on the fringe of this and see this really energetic engagement among these young Jews who really wanted a habitable form of Judaism in the contemporary world that was deeply engaged with their classic scriptures and Talmud, and that also really took account of the big modern academic discourses, but didn't allow them to take over the religion in bad sorts of ways. And also they were convinced that people of faith had to talk to each other seriously and had to, not just be in polemical relationship or distant relationship, but in the contemporary world, those people who were in faith, especially they felt in the Abrahamic faiths, needed to engage with each other more and more deeply. So they really welcomed those Christians who were in on the outside, and then soon afterwards Muslims as well. And what we founded then was called Scriptural Reasoning, and you can look at our website, the Cambridge Interfaith Programme website, or the University of Virginia website also has some of the best things. There's an online journal and all sorts of other things that are there available. But we went through all sorts of things during those early years trying to work, well, how do you do this? At heart, it's terribly simple. Jews, Christians, Muslims read their scriptures separately, all over the place. Why not occasionally read them together? Could anything be more natural? If you want to talk to each other, why not talk with the texts you love on the table and talk from faith to faith to faith? And also bring all your other, what Arif Nayed, actually, the author who's writing The Future of Muslim Theology, calls our internal libraries. He brought that up at one Scriptural Reasoning thing, and it was a wonderful way of describing how everyone around a table, when you're Scriptural Reasoning, brings their internal libraries, all the things they've been involved in. You may be a scientist, you may be a philosopher, you may be this, you may be that, you may be a, whatever you are, a nurse or whatever, and you bring all this to bear on your studying of Scripture. And the feeding of all those into it makes for a fascinating conversation. There's my book again, my goodness. So it's terribly simple, and it seems to me it's a very sensible thing to do. So what actually happens in a Scriptural Reasoning session? Well, there's all sorts of types of Scriptural Reasoning sessions, because as you might imagine, that it's now going on in all sorts of places and in all sorts of locations, not just in academic life, but one of our graduates here from Cambridge went to Cambridge, worked for the Three Faiths Forum there, and produced a thing called Tools for Trialogue for engaging with the three scriptures in a school's context. And it also happens in civil society and congregational, so local community contexts and so forth. And at international conferences, all sorts of places it's been tried. But what is it? What actually happens? Well, very simply, I mean, what usually happens is that you choose three texts or sets of texts from the three scriptures, and usually, you can circulate them in advance, or people can come and just see them, when they arrive at the session. And then you get into smallish groups, each ideally with Jewish, Christian, Muslim participation in them. And after a short introduction by somebody, has to be short, and this is not a place for pontificating, where somebody knows the meaning of this text definitively. It works on the process, on the fact that we recognise. It works on the fact that these texts are inexhaustible. They're endlessly rich. You never come to the end of these scriptures. And you just look at the traditions of commentary and law and so forth that attach to these traditions of scripture. And you see that for anybody to claim to have that overview of the complete meaning of it is just foolish. In other words, the basic mode of engagement with scriptures is inquiring, is asking and saying that we all have more and more and more to learn. And unless there's that spirit, if anyone is there saying, well, I have it all wrapped up, I know what this means definitively, who does? Because at the heart of each of the traditions is God, and who ever has God wrapped up? So the basic issue here is that it's a mode of inquiry, and then you get and try to discuss what the meaning of the text is. You can get off onto various things, but always come back to the text is the rule, because otherwise, if you once you leave that behind, then you just get into all sorts of further dimensions, which may be good to get into outside the session, but we found it's usually pretty wise to come back to the text and try to go deeper and deeper into that, and you see where the conversation leads. And I think the other thing that one notes, having done it for about 15 years or so, is that you need time. That these texts, each of our traditions knows that you need time in order to engage with Scripture. A lifetime, actually, and even that's not enough. Because of the sheer richness of each of them. And when you're together in a session like this, I think 2 hours is the very minimum you need to engage with 3 texts. And preferably you go for a few days at a time, and something happens actually when you stay overnight and when you engage, when you return again and again to these texts and engage in conversation with others who are inhabiting, their particular scriptures. Now that's just a brief sketch of what goes on in a scriptural reasoning session. I better watch my time. Yes, I do a bit more. Now I want to now just say 4 nots about it. What it is not, what scriptural reasoning is not about. And one is, it's not about agreement and consensus. Now, there may be agreement and consensus around scriptures, but these scriptures are very varied, the traditions are very varied, and there's no guarantee at all that you'll come to agreement at the end of it. And that's not the aim of it, actually. The aim is understanding and collegiality around that, to have a conversation, a respectful conversation around these texts, and not to feel any compulsion to come to agreed conclusions. The process is worthwhile in itself of engaging with these texts. That's the first knot. The second knot is that it's not about even a shared understanding of what our scriptures are. In other words, Muslims vary, but they have a variety of ways of regarding the Quran, what sort of a revelation this is, and so forth. Christians likewise. Christians are more deeply divided, I think, than Muslims in relation to how they regard their scriptures. And Jews, of course, have comparably huge divisions among themselves. You do not have to have any particular understanding of your own scripture or the other scriptures before you can sit down and read them with people. There will be meaning to be had, there will be conversations to be had that will be significant, even if you have around the table a great variety of ways of regarding the scriptures. And of course, at least there are 3, because certainly the Quran, the Tanakh and the Bible are read very different, are seen very differently by Christians, Muslims, Jews as scriptures. In other words, the word scripture is a nice general term, but it doesn't mean the same thing for a Muslim, a Jew or a Christian. And within Islam, Judaism, Christianity, there's also a range of understandings, often a range of legitimate understandings as well. Obviously each of those faiths rules out some more firmly than others, but also there are a variety of ways, even legitimately, within each of those traditions. So it's not about that. It's just about having those texts on the table and reading them and seeing how one comes to terms with the meanings that emerge from that. So that's the second knot. The third knot is that it's not, first of all, about solving the problems of the world. You don't do scriptural reasoning because you're sure it'll solve the Middle Eastern problem. Thank goodness. The Middle Eastern problem is terribly important, and it should be addressed, obviously. But it seems to me that there is something more fundamental, actually, than problem solving that's going on in the engagement around our scriptures, because each of the traditions, I think, at their best, engage with their scriptures for God's sake. not instrumentally, primarily, in order to accomplish something practical. Now, there are all sorts of practical outcomes of engaging with our scriptures, of course, but in the first place, and I think I have found over the years that if people try to instrumentalize the practice of scriptural reasoning, or just their practice of scripture, too severely, and say, look, we want it to solve this problem or something, then that somehow it's a shortcut that doesn't work. That your first engagement with scriptures as Muslims, Christians, Jews is, as the Jews say, Lishma, for the sake of the name. You do it for God's sake, because it pleases God that you're involved with these scriptures. And then you see what happens. There may be all sorts of extraordinarily important practical results out of it, but the purity of it is a sort of holiness, if you like. All of us see our scriptures as holy, and that the holiness is that it's the holiness of God, that one is doing this because it pleases God, and each of us and we trust that it also pleases God to introduce others to our scriptures as well, and to share them with each other. So that's the next knot, and the fourth knot is comes back to that thing about that you don't have a neat package as a result. That nobody has it all wrapped up. That it's not about a packaged understanding of these three complex texts, which we know just go on generating fresh interpretation, generation after generation after generation. In each of our traditions, there are different schools of understanding of things, and you just think of the different legal schools in Islam, for example, and the richness goes on and on and on, and therefore there's no neat package that sums it all up. And to come into this engagement thinking that you will emerge with a neatly packaged view of Christianity, or be able to sell a neatly packaged view of your own faith, so to speak, it seems to me is just a misunderstanding of the nature of our faiths. And for me, part of the experience of engaging in scriptural reasoning over the last 15 years has been to sort of infinitely complexify my understanding of Islam and Judaism, and also to change my view of Christianity too, as I engaged with fellow Christians in the process. That I just know now that you put one rich Quranic text in front of a group of Muslims, and they will come up with a rich set of readings. They'll have engaged with different aspects of the tradition, they will, and so forth. And especially if you then say, and how does this mean working today? How does it work out today? One of the themes we studied for some years in scriptural reasoning was debt, for example, and the whole of economics, and what does that mean today? And we know there's huge issues around how you handle money and debt and so forth in today's world. So that sense that some approaches to these religions say, now, this is what Islam is, this is what Judaism is, this is what Christianity is. That just goes out the door when you look at the fact that each of them are scriptural religions in which right at the heart of those scriptures are ongoing traditions of lively interpretation, of rereadings. I sometimes think that the way of summing up what one does at one's best, in a sense, in theology and religious studies is endless rereading. And we all know that you can read a book aged 15 and then you read it again aged 30 and you wonder whether it's the same book. Now the book hasn't changed, but you have, and it seems to me that that's what happens over the centuries with the interpretation of scriptures as well. So, what then, in summary, is scriptural reasoning about? Now, from what I've been saying, there's been an implicit positive in all these negatives, obviously. And first of all, it's about inquiry, it's about understanding with respect, it's about discussion and argument, and toleration of a certain sort of messiness, that you never have it all wrapped up. It's about differences as well as similarities. Our previous academic director of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, Nick Adams, summed it up as partnerships of difference. That's one of the things our world most needs. People who really do differ and don't pretend that we agree on the doctrine of the Trinity, but that we can have a partnership, nevertheless, in our world, in all sorts of ways. And that one of the ways of doing that is to engage in conversation around our scriptures. And it's also a practice that, as I said, I think really relies at heart on doing it for God's sake. And then you see what further benefits, further things overflow from that. But that God comes first in relation to this. Now, what all that allows at its best, I think, is what I would say a triple deepening. You get deeper into your own scriptures. There's nothing quite like being exposed to acute questioning from others around a table about the scripture you've known all your life, to make you rethink it and to make you reinvestigate. You'll find there are traditions of interpretation in your own tradition that you've never engaged with. There's tafsir here that really can speak to those questions and so forth, and therefore do you know them? And your ignorance of your own tradition is usually exposed in this process as well. The second deepening is you get deeper into the others' traditions, and that is, it seems to me, for the health of our world, but also for our just deeper understanding, in order to please God, I think, to really deeply understand with respect what others actually believe is an extraordinary benefit. And the third one is, the third deepening is you get deeper into engagement with the wider world, because I think it's very unhealthy if in interfaith engagement you're in an eyeball to eyeball with other people of faith and ignore the fact that you're all part of a wider world, and that what you should be doing, if you are serving a creator God, is to have at heart the welfare of the whole of creation. And therefore you have to have the welfare, the flourishing of the whole of the wider world at heart in this. And that's why, in my experience of scriptural reasoning, some of the things that work best are the ones, things like debt, that force you also to engage with the wider society as you engage with these other traditions as well. So there's that triple deepening that's at the heart of it. It's also, I think, important that it's a long-term practice, that you're committed to it long-term, just as one is committed to one's own faith long-term. So I think we need, in the ecosystem of engagement between faiths in our world, long-term practices that enable us to be faithful to each other in all our differences, and to build up those relationships that I think often are actually severely tested in the way in which our world is. And that sense of collegiality that builds up when you have been doing interpretation of each other's scriptures year after year after year, that is something quite unique in my experience. And it has, as I hinted earlier, led also to a quality of friendship that has been utterly astonishing and delightful. You get to know people somehow, even better than the eyeball to eyeball, talking personally. You get to know each other through their engagement with the texts that mean most to them, in a way that's quite remarkable. And therefore, my own conclusion about our world is that wherever I've seen cross-division relationships, organizations, movements really working, somewhere in the ecology there are always friendships, often courageous friendships that really cost something in order to sustain them in terms of how they are regarded in their own community when they have, you just try, if you're, in certain settings, if you're a Muslim and you have a close friendship with a Jew or a Christian or a close friend, with a Muslim, that it's no small thing, this. But it does seem to me that the sort of huge stresses and strains that are exerted on those of us who are really committed to interfaith engagement in our world, that friendships are the things that really sustain you through that. You have to have people who that you know in your own community and in others who will not wobble and will not give way under the sorts of pressures that everyone is exerted on everybody in this sort of world. And so I think scriptural reasoning is one practice that helps in this. Now, obviously, there are loads of other things that go on in the interfaith world, and we in the Cambridge Interfaith Programme are involved in many of them. And this is by no means the only thing that we're involved with. You can see on our website the large range of things we do. But I suppose I would come back to that image that I mentioned earlier of the DNA, that this is a DNA, that scriptural reasoning and the ethos that has accompanied it is the DNA of what we do. Now, I want just to, if there is time, is there, Michael, just to give 4 hopes for the future. I'll summarise them fairly quickly. Each of them I could go on for a very long time, I'm afraid, but I'm an academic. Here are 4 hopes. I mean, the first hope is a very simple one, that it will go on happening not only in academic circles but in many other settings. One of the founding Jewish members of it, who is part of that textual reasoning group, Peter Oakes, OCHS, in the University of Virginia, he has now begun 1,000 cities movement, which is basically saying that there are at least 1,000 cities in which Jews, Christians and Muslims read their scriptures separately, so why not read them together occasionally in those places, and it's now spread to one place after another. That's mainly in the States. So I hope it will happen, and I hope perhaps some of you will actually take part in this. And don't underestimate what it takes. It does take time and energy, and also the long-term commitment. I remember in the Scriptural Reasoning group that meets for an annual conference here in Cambridge for several days every year, the pivotal moment in that was when one of the members, a medical ethicist, she said, look, if we're serious about this, we need to be committed. Can we be committed for at least the next 5 years, this group? And some said yes, and some said no, because they knew realistically they couldn't. But that core of people who committed for that 5 years really made it happen, and it changed the whole practice, and sort of enabled us to do things in the confidence that we could really engage year after year with things, could grow in understanding, and that these were people that we could, have real disagreements with. That's the real mark of something like this, that you can have real disagreement, knowing that you are committed. It's like a bit like marriage, where you can have real disagreements within marriage because one trusts that one genuinely is committed. So the first thing is, I hope it will continue. The second thing is that I hope it might help in realising the promise of some of the really important interfaith initiatives that have been happening. Above all, I think that initiative, A Common Word Between Us and You, that 138 Muslim leaders sent to the Pope and all other Christian leaders in October 2007. We in the Cambridge Interfaith Programme have been deeply involved in that, and there's a lovely little document that, Michael, I hope all your students will be given. The Muslim Academic Trust has just produced a book on a common word for use in mosques and parishes, and this is, let's see, I have it here somewhere, it's on the floor, yes. This, A Common Word, Text and Reflections, edited by Leila Demiri, some of you who will know. And Tim Winter has a piece in it, and also a Catholic theologian as well. And it's a lovely book, which and it gives the text of the letter as well. But that is something that is based on scriptural texts, and some of the signatories of it, like Arif Nayed, who I mentioned, had been involved in scriptural reasoning for some time, but also as a way of spreading that sort of pattern of interfaith engagement further. It seems to me that this gathering around scriptures is very fruitful. We did it actually in our in the conference that we had here in October 2008, I think it was, which was where we had some extraordinary array of Muslim and Christian leaders from various parts, and it was just fascinating. My little group, my little scriptural reasoning group then, included Habib Ali Al-Jifri from the Taba Foundation, and we were discussing forgiveness. And we had texts on forgiveness from this was just Muslim Christian, not Jewish, because that's the common word, is Muslim Christian, and we had these texts and on forgiveness, and there'd been an assassination attempt on him in the Yemen, and just a few weeks previously, and he'd escaped, but 2 of the assassins had been killed, and 3 others had been imprisoned, and he'd gone to see them in prison, and he gave an account of his conversations with those people who had tried to kill him in prison, and reflected on the nature of forgiveness in that. It was quite extraordinary. And also in the group was Francis Young, who had been professor at the University of Birmingham, pro-vice-chancellor there. She's a Methodist theologian, and the Bishop of Rochester, Michael Nazarali, and Arab Nayed, and a Jesuit from the Vatican as well in that conversation. And to have all of those people studying Scripture together and to be talking about the theme of forgiveness was just electrifying. But this is all a way of, by example, saying that I hope that Scriptural Reasoning might be something that, if it takes on with people like you, could go into all sorts of settings, and not least into those settings that are the follow-up to some of these fruitful interfaith initiatives. That's the second hope on the interfaith initiative side. The third hope is that it will be developed in more academic ways, in various ways. And Peter Oakes in the University of Virginia already has a graduate student, a doctoral program in this. It's called Scripture Interpretation and Practice. And there's interesting research put at the University of Toronto on Jewish and Islamic law that I was one of the referees for the Canadian government grant-giving body that helped to fund it. And there's a fascinating 3-year project that the Centre of Theological Inquiry in Princeton did, which was explicitly people involved in Scriptural Reasoning, which produced a book called Crisis, Call and Leadership in the Abrahamic Traditions. And so on and so on. There's all sorts of things happening, but I think this academic side of this needs to flourish alongside the more interfaith practical side, and also the sort of general just people doing it for its own sake side. And then the fourth one is something that's occupying me at the moment, which is that I've been invited to give the John Paul II lecture on interreligious understanding in Rome, in the Angelicum University. Gosh, sorry. That was what you've been trying to do, and then it has to be. I think it still works.
Hopefully.
And this invitation has made me think quite a lot about the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, it has had a remarkable response, actually, to a common word, and there's now every 2 years there's a gathering at the Vatican of signatories of a common word, meeting with Roman Catholic theologians. But it seems to me that the fulfillment of the Second Vatican Council, which was so important for me as a teenager, has yet to be seen, really, in the interfaith. I mean, it's best known for Nostra Aetate, which was particularly good on relations of Catholics with Jews, not quite so good on Islam and so forth. But I think that actually the way in which the Second Vatican Council renewed Roman Catholic engagement with the Scriptures is one of the most important things of all, and long term will be very important for interfaith engagement. In other words, it's Dei Verbum is the document of the Second Vatican Council that I think has huge fruitfulness potentially in the interfaith area, and I'm looking forward to trying to get involved with people in Rome in discussing whether this might be so. And Steve Kepnes, one of the person who's doing the future of Jewish thought, he is giving a course of lectures on Scriptural Reasoning in the Gregorian University in Rome this term, actually. And I'll be very interested to see what response has come of those. But the final thing about the hope is that we were approached by the nuns of Turvey Abbey recently, who do something called Lectio Divina. Some of you may know of it. It's a form of meditation on Scripture that's deeply there in the Catholic tradition, especially the monastic traditions of Catholicism. And she said, look, we'd love to try to see if this can have an interfaith dimension. So we've planned for something next September, a gathering, in which there will be Muslims, Jews and Christians engaged in this practice of Lectio Divina, a meditative practice, but on the three Scriptures together, which I don't think has happened before in that way. And we'll see what happens. And one of the further questions for me from that is, what are the Muslim practices in relation to Scriptures that could be shared analogously, so to speak, that you could improvise upon in order to engage with the Bible and the Tanakh as well? Are there such? And I'd be very interested to know whether you've got any ideas about that. But very finally, just to come back to those deeper, the deeper into your own faith, deeper into the other's faith, deeper into the whole of the world and its flourishing. There is a fourth deeper as well. I remember I tried this out on Peter Oakes last summer, and he said, oh, there's a fourth deeper. And the fourth deeper, he said, is the going deeper into that engagement with that collegiality, that community, that network of relationships of people who are involved in all this. In other words, that you can't avoid the fact that as you go forward, you need companions who are committed to each other, and you need to go deeper into that relationship as well. And I think that's one of my greatest hopes for the whole of interfaith engagement, that in whatever ways, and of course it doesn't just happen through reading scriptures together, it happens in all sorts of other ways as well, all sorts of practical ways, but that sort of thing can be on the agenda for, if you're interested enough to come to a lecture like this, let's hope you're interested enough to commit yourself to be involved in those sort of relationships long term. I think that it's unspectacular, it's long term, it's not, it won't hit the headlines and it won't directly solve the Middle Eastern crisis, but my goodness, I think it has the capacity to change the ecology of relations between our faiths in the long term. That's all.